Hi, Michael. This is Ben. This is Kieffer. We are the co-creative directors of WMGIC conference. We are super excited to have you today and to be able to take some time and ask you questions about the Indonesian palm oil industry and our specific research question, which is how can we improve regulatory oversight of the palm oil industry in Kalimantan? So just to get us started, can you provide us a bit of background about the palm oil industry in Indonesia and Kalimantan? Why is it such a hot button issue on the global stage? Yeah.
Thanks a lot, guys, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be talking to you. I think first of all the way from Indonesia, and I'm really glad to see that this topic is of a lot of interest, especially all the way in the US. I think when we talk about palm oil, I think it's sort of important to start with the commodity itself. Basically the oil palm as a plant originated from West Africa, and it was brought to Indonesia and to Malaysia sort of in the early 20th century. But now around 85% or over 85% of global production of palm oil actually comes from Malaysia and Indonesia. The fruit itself, or the palm itself, the product that it generates is incredibly versatile. The flesh of the fruit is crushed to produce crude palm oil. The seeds are crushed to produce kernel oil. And then after that, what we see is that there are literally dozens and dozens of derivatives that are generated from those two products. And those two derivatives, even the waste products that the palm basically generates, are essentially essential ingredients in quite a lot of consumer products. Really everything, stretching from chocolate sometimes to ice cream, to washing powder, to soap, to shampoo, and so on. Even of course in biofuels, and also in cooking oil. So the product is incredibly versatile. It's relatively cheap to produce, and it's also very efficient to produce. It generates about 6 to 10 times as much in terms of volume per hectare as other oils. So the key thing to note here is that there is a huge demand driver of why palm oil is important and why it's relevant to us. About 40% of global consumed oil is basically palm oil. So it's a huge product. The other thing I think that a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of, because the things that we see a lot in the media and the stories about palm oil, which tend to be very negative, sometimes for good reason, is of course that it plays a huge amount of role in national and local economies, basically in Malaysia, in Indonesia, and also elsewhere. So just in Indonesia, since about 2000, about 1 million families have been lifted out of poverty as a result of the palm oil industry directly. It employs about 3 million people worldwide, and it's about a $40 billion industry. So it's a huge economic driver that is important to both national, but then global, but also local economies. So there's really very strong reasons why palm oil is so widespread, why it is important internationally, and why even a lot of NGOs will say, well, actually boycotting palm oil is not the solution, because that demand for the edible oils will just shift to somewhere else. And where will that be produced? And what social, environmental, and economic risks are associated with greater production of other palm oil, or of other oils, essentially. And so, at the same time, over the last 30 years in Indonesia, we have seen about a 10-fold increase in production. And that obviously brings that just the sheer scale of a land-intensive commodity obviously brings together these kind of environmental, social, and economic issues that we'll talk about.
Thank you so much. And now could you please provide our student teams with a brief overview of the main stakeholders in Kalimantan's palm oil industry?
Mhm. I mean, it's a there's a huge list, and so I think maybe we could try to split it up a little bit into sort of on the producer side, right? On the producer side, you will of course have the companies themselves and the owners of those companies. Palm oil, if you look at sort of the 20 top richest people in Indonesia, quite a lot of those families are going to be also involved in palm oil. So there are the concession holders, and the concession holders are both nationals and also international companies, huge conglomerates, whether it's Golden Agri or Sime Darby, or people like Cargill, for example, which are of course involved also with potentially other commodities as well. Then there are, of course, the smallholder farmers. So about 40% of the production in Indonesia is actually done by smallholder farmers. That is, a really complex topic that I think maybe we can touch on a little bit later on from the regulatory aspect of it, because these are independent. These are small farmers. By definition, they're about less than 50 hectares in the scope of area. But again, there's a huge variety within that. They could be a smallholder farmer with 2 hectares. They could be a smallholder farmer with 50 hectares. There's a huge discrepancy within that. There are, of course, the workers, the local communities that are surrounding these palm oil concessions. And again, it's very important, I think, for your participants to understand that the palm oil industry isn't just concessions. There is this whole other supply base which is focused on local families, local people, local farmers that could be providing, as I said, about 40% actually of the feedstock that ultimately goes into the supply chain. There are other people who focus on providing microfinance to local communities. There are traders. There are, of course, the communities that surround the concessions or that live in production areas that might be both positively and negatively involved. And then there is really the regulatory side of things, where we are looking at sort of local government, national government, which sets laws, local regulations, which also helps to determine where the locations of the concessions will be, what will be the production area, and so on. There are, of course, NGOs, both local and international, which are also sort of focusing not necessarily on the regulatory side. It can be much broader than that, but really, what does kind of sustainable production of palm oil actually look like? So, and of course, the certification bodies that are trying to push the standards into as broad a base of production as possible. And I think the last thing, and again, this is sort of more important in the consumption countries, is of course the buyers, the processors, the refiners, and then the consumer goods companies that are actually turning that raw product into something that we consume. And they have an enormous influence on what happens on the ground, potentially, although some of them might argue otherwise. But these are not, these are not just Western companies that, for your likes of Procter & Gamble or Unilever or Pepsi or Mars and so on, that are going to be sort of influencing the Western market, working within the Western market. But actually, out of the sort of the top 5 countries that are actually utilizing or buying or consuming palm oil, 3 of those are China, India, and Indonesia as well. So those buyers are kind of spread across the world, and they are not one unified body.
That's absolutely fascinating and a great overview to just who's involved in such a complex supply chain and industry and set of social forces. We're curious, what are the key conservation, environmental, sustainability challenges linked to palm oil production that proceed from those actors? And what are the main challenges that specifically local populations are facing?
Yeah, so I mean, To be honest, we could talk for hours about this, and there are many sort of many more sort of detailed kind of layers underneath everything that you know, in this sort of brief summary that I can give you. And I would really encourage actually your you know, your participants to spend time actually researching the issues more in depth, really just to sort of delve into this, you know, pick a specific topic, and you'll see that all of these things are sort of slightly interlinked, but they are at the same time, you know, quite discrete, you know, topics and issues that can be sort of pulled out. You know, the media is of course a great tool for this. NGO reports are of course a great tool for looking at, you know, what are the kind of the main issues and how those issues are changing over time, because a lot of these issues are dynamic in their nature. And they also change as the industry sort of starts to mature, and you know, replanting happens and all of these kinds of things. And of course, as the buyer market also changes. But you know, we also, it's important to also have a look at, for example, the company's own websites where they are tracking their grievances, for example, or the certification systems where they're tracking their grievances, and really just to reach out to practitioners within this to sort of learn more about it. So, I mean, this is just a very brief sort of overview, I guess, you know, with regards to some of the issues. This is not an extensive list, of course, you know. So, I mean, again, I think maybe starting on the social side, which of course touches upon local communities. You know, we know, for example, that indigenous groups and local farmers have been displaced by sort of unscrupulous companies, right? There is an issue of land grabbing, whereby there is a poor kind of level of seeking consent of local communities before the development actually takes place, you know, or there is a sort of, you could say, negligent or sometimes willful negligence in seeking approval of local communities, and what level of the local community you should seek the approval of when developing, you know, these huge plantations. And some of them, you know, we're looking at sort of 20,000 to potentially 100,000 hectares. So this impact, this is a huge impact that will have. It effectively changes the structure of how local people can live, how they make money, and also their dependency on the development itself, right? Because the development might bring with it lots of positives. So, for example, you know, better roads, which a lot of communities want. It might bring together, you know, schools, clinics, all of these things that local communities, you know, feel very positive about. But it also then has negative impacts in, for example, you know, the clearing of the forest reduces their ability to access micronutrients from that forest on which they were dependent on. They lose their hunting grounds, for example. There is a pollution problem in the waterways, can be impacted, and so on and so forth. And of course, given the fact that this is a 25-year cycle, this is a long-term change. This is a generational change that will take place. And of course, there could be replanting that happens. In many cases, under Indonesian regulation, about 20% of the concession should be given to smallholder farmers under what is called a plasma scheme. But sometimes what we find is this kind of a well, I would say it's sort of it's a system through which local communities are effectively supported to grow palm oil, and these schemes take many different forms. But in a sort of a brief overview, the company will effectively purchase that palm oil, and how involved that community is, whether it's just a profit sharing arrangement or whether the communities actually work on that land, really sort of depends. It varies, but sometimes you can find is that there are very sort of poor commercial agreements between smallholders and the companies that are there. There are of course poor conditions, sometimes child labor issues, even forced labor has been found in some of these areas. And I would encourage people to have a look at some of the grievances that come up in the certification standards. A lot of them are about labor, and they will get a little bit more sort of details on this. So again, there are benefits in terms of economic benefits, access to healthcare, access to education. In many cases, the companies effectively take on the role of that is missing from the local government. But of course, that has severe kind of social issues and fundamental structural changes within the communities, the local economies, and potentially within that basically just last for generations, and potentially are irreversible, right? I mean, the other aspect of it, if we look at, for example, in Kalimantan, where there is about 6 million hectares of palm oil plantations, we know that according to the Borneo Atlas, about 1.4, 1.5 million hectares of forest have been lost since about 2000. There is a link between palm oil and deforestation. And certainly a historic one. What we're seeing now is that this is changing. Palm oil driven deforestation is declining really quite significantly. There is still deforestation, but in terms of who is responsible for this, it seems that there is a significant year-on-year decline in terms of the concessions, so these industrial estates being responsible for deforestation. There are, of course, exceptions to it. Papua is a very big example where you get one company that might clear 100,000 hectares of forest, right? And of course, all of these things and the development on peat, which is now banned under the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil. This releases huge amounts of carbon dioxide, of course, into the atmosphere. It increases the risk of wildfire, and of course, that biodiversity impact and human wildlife conflict. We don't really need to discuss that. You lose such a huge area of forest. The biodiversity impact is of course devastating. The problem, of course, is, and this is maybe why we don't talk about rapeseed oil, or other types of oils, is that it is much more sudden in these tropical countries, and of course the countries where palm oil is grown are mega diverse forested countries, tropical countries where the forest is really very important for biodiversity and very important globally, and this is also one of the reasons why it's such a big issue compared to potentially other forms of oils. So I mean, it's very, I have to say, it's very dynamic. We know, for example, that more of the deforestation is now potentially being caused by smallholder farmers that are kind of that are in these forest frontier areas, rather than large oil companies. It is also shifting geographically. There's more deforestation happening in Papua, Western Africa, and so on. And different actors might be sort of driving this as well. Yeah. So maybe that's just a very brief overview of very complex issues.
Yeah, these conservation and environmental challenges we asked about are definitely very complex, and we appreciate the insight into it. And so to move on, one of the things Ben and I came across while we were researching for the case is there's all these regulating bodies and all this regulation, and we're seeing companies, these big suppliers like Nestle, saying that they're committing to 100% sustainable palm oil, but then you dive a little bit deep into their supply chain, and we're not really seeing all these regulations being met, and we're not seeing this sustainable supply chain like we'd want to. So we were wondering what parts of the supply chain for Kalimantan palm oil are very hard to regulate or unclear in both the private and public sector.
Mm-hmm. I think there are, again, it's a really sort of broad topic to think about, and maybe what I will maybe just sort of leave you guys with a couple of examples that are quite interesting in terms of focusing on. One is, and it's interesting that you mentioned a specific company name. There are other companies that have, very similar issues. So the companies themselves, through sort of push of other actors, the other stakeholders, whether it's their consumers or campaigning NGOs, or even governments. in some cases, for example, the EU is looking at legislation with regards to what palm oil it actually imports into the bloc. The companies can make commitments, for example, to no deforestation, but then they do not necessarily bear the strength over the supply. And let us say that somebody breaks that sustainability commitment of the company. What do you then do with that actor? Do you then cut them out of the supply chain, which is what is being requested effectively by a lot of the NGOs? But then what happens to that actor? As I mentioned already, 3 of the top 5, actually 4 of the top 5, may not have very good standards in terms of the palm oil that they are seeking in terms of sustainability. So China, India, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And so that actor doesn't then become reliant on, for example, Nestle pushing it into doing something. They have an option to enter what we call the leakage market and simply sell to that market, so you create a 2-tier market effectively. One is the sustainable palm oil, and one is what you could refer to as an unsustainable palm oil, right? And so then you have to think about, okay, well, this company's supply chain might then be clean, because what they do is they focus on the best of the best, right? They focus on the companies where there is no longer deforestation, but that might also be that there is no forest to clear within their concession or within their land bank. And it might have been past deforestation that would have happened there. But then what else? Have you actually made a change? Have you actually made an impact on the palm oil supply chain as a whole and on the environment and social aspects as a whole by driving these actors effectively out of the sustainable palm oil supply chain? And so that's a really critical issue that many people are dealing with right now. What do you do? Do you forever keep these guys out, or do you have to figure out some sort of a system through which they can return back into the fold? Let's say the sustainable palm oil supply chain. But then how do you do that without creating loopholes, creating incentives, and so on and so forth, right? That you clear and then you pay, a fine effectively, or that you just kind of welcome back. So that is one thing, is that actually we have influence over a specific portion of the supply chain. That force might be quite limited, but that there is an entire leakage system effectively available out there, an entire leakage market available out there, which is very difficult to regulate unless the actors within these other countries become more interested in sustainability. The other aspect of it is, of course, and something I mentioned before, is the smallholders. And smallholders is a very complex issue. It is a livelihood issue because people's livelihoods depend on being able to generate some income, and in many of these areas, palm oil is the most attractive and the most profitable way of actually generating that income. At the same time, they are the drivers in some cases of deforestation in these forest frontier areas. As people get more wealthier, they have more money to reinvest into increasing their holdings and so on and so forth, right? So and these actors, some of them are under the plasma schemes, but the majority that are sort of more difficult to regulate are, of course, these independent actors. Some of them might be associated with a cooperative. Some of them might not be. Some of them might just be independent actors where there is a trader who comes and collects the palm oil. Very, very difficult to get through to these actors individually. And it's also very difficult for companies to actually monitor what their supply base looks like, because their supply base can sometimes be sort of this hourglass shaped. It's very complicated. The palm oil the fruit gets passed from trader to trader, from mill. The trader might sell to one mill one month, might sell to another mill another month, and so on and so forth. So it's very difficult to track which areas are actually supplying into your supply chain. And as a result of that, it's very difficult to identify which smallholders you're actually looking at. But you can do this in general aspects of it. And there are lots of technological solutions to looking at that, existing ones already, looking at, well, where your supply base is, what are the what are the deforestation risks within those supply bases. But in terms of identifying the individual farmer, individual plots, for example, that are supplying the supply chain, that is very difficult to do. You have to sort of generalize and focus more on the supply shed and landscape level initiatives in those regards. So those, I think, would be very interesting to focus on for your, for your stakeholders.
As a quick follow-up, does that idea around like the leakage market, is that also represented in just like the different like human rights and social rights that we're seeing affected by the palm oil industry? So you mentioned forced labor earlier, but also just other forms of human trafficking, child labor, poor wages, and so on. Is that also part of what's visible in the sustainable palm oil industry, and then what's not visible in the invisible leakage market?
Well, I mean, it's effectively hidden. I mean, of course, a lot of these issues are illegal, right? And it's not necessarily just through the visualization of the certification system, implementation of the certification systems, and having the audits under those systems, but it's also an enforcement issue in terms of laws. And so this particular problem is then not necessarily a problem of regulation within the producer countries. In many cases, that legislation, the signing up of international treaties on international labor organizations, for example, or other sort of compacts on child labor and child trafficking and so on, the producer countries are likely to be signatories to these conventions. They're likely to have laws that focus on them. The problem is with the enforcement of those laws. And so, of course, if you're not monitoring it, if you're not bringing that up, then it becomes invisible to the buyers as well. And that is, of course, the benefit of a certification system.
So, I mean, you mentioned certification systems, and the most famous one is the one done by RSPO. That's a body that you've served multiple roles on, including right now with the Assurance Standing Committee. We were just curious if you could summarize or give some just perspective on what the RSPO is and what it does, and how this contrasts, as you mentioned, also a bit with other governing bodies within Indonesia, like the ISPO.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think quite a lot of this is actually linked to your previous question. Why do certification systems exist in the first place? And it is really because there are enough stakeholders who believe that there is a government regulatory failure, that what they see as needing to be done in terms of, let's say, production of sustainable palm oil is not secured by regulation alone. And so a kind of a voluntary standard is born out of this. And there needs to be some incentives, I think, for the industry to then start to get accreditation or certification under that certification system, which of course means that there needs to be enough of a pressure to push those growers into that certification system, or buyers insisting, or market pressure. So both sort of reputational pressure, but there also needs to be a consumer pressure, in the sense that people demand that better standards are effectively met. And then you have this kind of the development of these certification systems, and the certification systems tend to be, as the RSPO is, multi-stakeholder, and so they have representatives from everywhere, from the grower community to the NGO community to the financial institutions and so on. And the certification standard is effectively formed as it's a standard, of course. What are the criteria that need to be met? As a result of that, the certification standard's role is effectively to manage that, make sure that all of the supporting structure in achieving that standard is effectively there. But really, there is an ongoing role of the individual stakeholders in driving that standard into more of an evolution, into something better, stronger, and more credible. The standards have to always remain robust, of course, but they also have to remain relevant. And this is what was demanded in 2005 might not be the same of what was demanded in 2020 right now. You know, deforestation, for example, deforestation commitments are a very good example of that, and how they have sort of evolved and then effectively been inserted into the RSPO standard. But it is incredibly difficult to manage a standard like this, because you have a consensus-based mechanism with multiple stakeholders, all of which are seeking potentially slightly different things. They might have the same sort of vision, but they might be seeking, you know, different pathways to get to that vision, or different avenues, or different sort of flavors of that vision. They might also have different experiences from the ground, from the consumer aspect, for example, and so on. And so it's very difficult to manage all of this and allow the system to be dynamic fast enough to remain relevant, right? And so this is, you know, ongoing challenges, of course, for the RSPO. The RSPO needs to be seen to be sort of slightly independent of any particular stakeholder group. No stakeholder group can have a majority effectively within that, majority say within that standard, of course, and a bias towards that. But to then kind of be more nimble and be more flexible is very, very difficult. And of course, there are a plethora of issues. And I would, you know, recommend, again, I think, to look at, there have been recent reports by Greenpeace, for example, and the Environmental Investigations Agency, which talk about these sorts of issues that the certification standards face in more detail.
And now, so besides your role at the RSPO, you're now working at Lestari Capital. And so as we're wrapping up this conversation, could you tell us a little bit more about your work at Lestari Capital and what you see in the future of sustainable palm oil, including any key areas for innovation?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously my favorite topic, right? I will try to summarize what we do in a sort of, maybe starting with a slight issue. The problem is, and has been for decades, that, you know, conservation, restoration, well, just protection of the environment has always been in this realm of charitable giving, CSR, philanthropy. And so projects that are actually generating a common good as a result of this are effectively always dependent on donor financing, on CSR, and so on. And so they are always seen almost as an afterthought and as a charitable thing, right? At the same time, that fundamental problem, if you think about it slightly differently, is that they are generating something which we all benefit from, not just locally, but internationally as well, and globally. They are protecting forests, they're protecting biodiversity, they're protecting peat, preventing carbon dioxide entering into the atmosphere, and so on. But there is no recognition, there is no market recognition of the value of the thing that they are producing, right? And so what we are working on is trying to change that topic, really. And the fact is that there are actually demands, there are new demand streams by the industry which are actually demanding conservation. And what we're doing is we're developing financial structures, we're effectively identifying that demand, we're structuring the demand, and we're conceptualizing the financial models that could basically allow that demand to meet the project supply and be transferring conservation finance to those projects, make those scalable models, make those performance-based models, because we obviously want the projects to be successful and to deliver the impact that they need, and to link that to the claims that the companies want to make around their sustainability. So that's effectively where, you know, where we work from. I think where the future of this comes, where the future in this comes from, is really that we need to start looking at, you know, some of the issues that we talked about before, is that we need to start looking at proactive support of conservation. We need to not be reactive in the way that we actually do conservation. So deforestation has happened. Okay, what do we do about it now? We need to start thinking about how do we prevent that deforestation happening in the first place, and what role does business basically play in that? So that's really the kind of the crux of what we do. Yeah.
Well, that's a fascinating summary of your work currently. just as we're about to head off, we're curious if you have any last minute tips and words of advice for the student teams.
I think not to focus on any particular topic, really. I think what is important, especially nowadays, is to always kind of scratch beneath the surface. And you will see, of course, in the newspapers and everywhere, very sensationalist headlines, because that's what sells the newspapers. But it's very important, I think, especially when you come to sort of delve deeper into the topic, to delve a little bit under the surface. It probably won't take much to delve under the surface and realize that the complexity of the problems are huge. If we look at deforestation entering into the supply chain as an example, okay, well, it might be smallholders, but other smallholders, what is driving the smallholders to do that? Is it poverty, for example? Is it a desire is it a lack of value of the forest that they might be converting, and so on? The interplay of all of these issues is really quite huge. And so I think it's very, very easy to focus on one issue, but really you need to kind of take a little bit of a step back and look at the interplay of the economy, the environment, and the social aspects much more in the solutions that you're kind of thinking about and developing. I think that would be the main kind of piece of advice.
Awesome. Thank you so much for all of your ideas that you've shared, all the information you've shared, the advice you've shared. Thank you for speaking to us today. We really enjoyed it.
Yeah, we appreciate it. And I know our student teams will as well.
All right. Thanks very much.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye. Bye.